Woohoo! We're live. This is Math 60, Intermediate Algebra 5.9 from Chapter 5, the chapter that would not die, the chapter on polynomials, and we are currently factoring polynomials. And so I'm guessing that after 400 hours of homework, you're asking yourself, why are we here? Why are we doing this? Why are we factoring? And the answer is, well, because of course we're trying to solve equations. What else? So 5.9, solving equations by factoring. The first thing I want to be clear, because I know a lot of people come into this class with this, but a quadratic equation is an equation of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c represent real numbers and a is not equal to 0. So specifically, this is an x squared plus x plus a number, and it has to be equal to 0. Pardon me. And we're going to start off with one of my favorite things in the universe, the zero factor property, or just the zero property. And it has one of my favorite things in it. This is not a misspelling. I know this is unusual. Usually things like this are misspellings. The word if is a contraction. It means if and only if. And it can be written as a two-way arrow. So if and only if means both lead to each other. So let's take a look. If a times b equals 0, then a equals 0 or b equals 0. If a equals 0 or b equals 0, then a times b equals 0. So now I think the second one is easier to see. So let's take a look at this one. If a equals 0 or b equals 0, and or includes the possibility they both do. So mathematically, a could be 0, b could be 0, they could both be 0. But we know that there's at least one 0, then a times b has to be 0. So if you multiply anything by 0, you end up with 0. So that's the first one. That one is probably easier. Let's go up above. This is the more interesting one. If a times b equals 0, so if you multiply two secret numbers together and you got 0, then I will tell you that the only way to get there is that either a is 0 or b is 0 or both. What do you think about that? This is not something I can prove to you. This is something that you pretty much have to agree is like a basic foundational agreement. And I will tell you that I've spent years rolling this over in my head, trying to come up with interesting ways to say this. But I will tell you that I agree. I think this is true. And this is absolutely true. That the only way to multiply two numbers together, 5 times 6, 1/4 times pi, any two numbers, if the resulting product is 0, you had to start with 0. So the only way to get 0 as an answer is to say 0 times 1/4. That gives you 0. But you can't multiply like 1/4 times 4 and get 0. If neither of these two factors are 0, then you can't have a product that's 0. So this is the zero factor property, and this is going to be a foundational property going forward. What this will allow us to do is to say anytime we have something that equals 0, if we can break the left side up, no matter how complicated it is, if we can break it up into factors, then each of those factors will give us our possible answers. So let's take a look. The first one is a problem that you could solve in a lot of ways. I could take the 4, chuck it over to the other side, add 4 to both sides, and then I could use some square roots. And that would give us an answer. But instead, I'm going to approach it in a slightly different way. X squared minus 4 is a difference of 2 squares, right? X squared minus 2 squared. So I can factor this into x plus 2 times x minus 2. Now, what's the difference other than it got a lot bigger? Well, the big difference is that I've got multiplication in between. Before I had a minus in between. A minus is not going to help us. Pluses and minuses, generally not that helpful. I know you learned them first when you were very small. You learned to add and subtract, and they became your best friends, especially when mean multiplication showed up and it was so hard. But in the long run, multiplication is a better friend. So I'm sure there's something really profound there, but it's over my head. The point is multiplication is going to be there for you, because if these two things multiplied give you 0, then you know one of them has to be 0. So I'm going to say x plus 2 equals 0, or x minus 2 equals 0. One of these two, or maybe both. So let's see. On the left side, I get x equals negative 2. On the right side, I get x equals 2. So I get two answers, which I can write either separately or as a plus or a minus. This one kind of works out. So a couple things to notice. First off, x squared gave us two answers. Generally, this will be true, although sometimes, especially if you're looking like x cubed or x to the fourth, sometimes some of those answers are going to be really hard to find. So as you go on and take more algebra, we'll teach you more techniques to find some of these answers, because some of them are really brutally hard to find. The second thing to notice is that when I set up my zero factor property right here, if I have x plus 2, the answer ends up being minus 2. If I have x minus 2, the answer ends up being plus 2. So remember, there's that opposite thing that's happening here. So keep that in mind. A lot of people like to skip these parts and they get the signs wrong. So be very, very careful, especially if you've never done this before. Go through all, even if you're looking at this going, seriously, we have to do this? The answer is yes, you should. Get lots of practice. And then once you're really good and you get it all right, then stop using all the steps if you feel like it. Okay, next problem. Well, we've got a quadratic. There's our x squared. The problem is we don't have a 0. So when we've got a quadratic, our first approach will be to go ahead. Let me write it over here so I've got a little bit more room. I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides. And I get x squared minus x minus 6 equals 0. Okay, next thing. This is a quadratic. There's 0. Can I factor this? And the answer is yes. This factors. This is a trinomial. And it factors x times x. I have to think of two numbers that multiply to give me negative 6. Let me try negative 3 and positive 2. Does this work? X squared plus 2x minus 3x. Yeah, that'll give us the minus x there. And minus 6. Yep, there we go. Okay, once you've got it factored, then we use the 0 factor property. Either x minus 3 equals 0 or x plus 2 equals 0. My equals fell apart. So my two answers are x equals negative 2 or positive 3. Notice that they're not always going to match. This one happened to match because of the fact that this was a difference of 2 squares, right? So this was a slightly different situation. This one is much more common that you'll end up with two different numbers, and frequently one is positive, one is negative, but that's not always the case. They could both be negative, they could both be positive. And I hear you asking, wait, how do we check to make sure our answers are correct? Well, if you wanted to check this, what you would do is you would take this negative 2 and pop it right back in here. So let's think negative 2 squared is 4, and then minus a negative 2, minus a negative 2. So 4 plus 2 is 6. Yep. Let's try 3. 3 squared is 9, minus 3 is 6. So it did work out. Woohoo! Okay, one more page, and then this beast will be done. I'm very excited. I hope you're very excited. The end of chapter 6. Woohoo! Let's not talk about chapter 5. Oh man, Freudian slip. The end of chapter 5, and then we can start chapter 6, which will totally not be this long, maybe. Yay.